Well, hello again. So we're in week 4 of Jesusy Life. This is the last week of this series. Next week, we'll be jumping into a new series just to give you a little preview of it. It's called Who Needs Christmas? So that's happening over the next 3 Sundays. You may be the kind of person that is already sick to death of Christmas. Like you've been hearing Christmas songs in department stores since roughly September, and you are just exhausted by it. Some of you are the kind of people who you live for this time of year. You absolutely love this time of year. You wish that there was more snow in the state that you live in than there is, right? You would inject Bing Crosby, Mariah Carey, and CeeLo Green into your veins if you could. Like, you're anywhere on that spectrum, by the way, this series is for you. Because around this time of year, whether you're highly celebratory or just sick of it and ready for it to be over, the question is, like, who needs this? Why do we celebrate this? Why does this matter so much? And we're going to look at that over the next 3 weeks, and we hope that you will join us for that. Last week of Jesusy Life, I want to talk to you about kind of a recap of what we've looked at the last few weeks. So first of all, we talked about our hope for you. And our hope for you is that your life would be formed by Jesus. That's our hope for you. So if whether you're a follower of Jesus or whether you're brand new to faith, Christianity, you're not sure what you think about it yet, even if that's you, you're here and you're like, I'm pretty sure I don't believe any of this. Our hope for you still is that at some point, your life would be formed by Jesus. That's our hope for you. And so we talked about what it looks like to make Jesus the Lord of your life, the master of your life. And what it really looks like is to be with Jesus and to learn from Jesus how to be like Jesus. And we use Dallas Willard's quote on this, to be with Jesus and to learn from Jesus how to be like Jesus. So it's not just that whole, like, I'm gonna choose to put my trust in Jesus and then we're set. It's like, that's the starting place for what a life of faith looks like. But once you've put your faith in Jesus and you've said, like, man, I want you to be Lord of my life, then there is a slow but steady process of learning what a life shaped by Christ looks like after that. So we said this in the first week, and it's really important that Christianity isn't primarily about something you believe, but someone you become. It's not just about a belief system. Lots of people believe a lot of the teachings of Christianity, but their lives aren't actually that different. So in week 2, Audrey talked to us about the fact that a big reason that we don't spend time with Jesus, learning from Jesus, how to be like Jesus, is because we're maxed out. We don't have any margin in our lives. And so when a pastor gets up and says, like, you know what you need to do? You need to spend more time with Jesus. All of us feel like, come on, man, like, give me a break. I'm giving it all I've got, right? I don't know what else I can possibly do here. And it was just this reminder in week 2 that we're actually not asking you to do more. We're asking you to do less. That if you want to prioritize Jesus in your life, that's going to require you to choose not to do some other things so that you can actually spend some time with Jesus, learning from Jesus how to be like Jesus. The goal is not time management, right? Audrey said our goal is transformation, not time management. It's not about how can I sometime become a time magician and just like cram more things in. The goal is to say, like, actually, there's some things I'm doing now that may be good things. They may be great things. But if I'm going to prioritize spending time with Jesus, learning from Jesus how to be like Jesus, I may need to cut back on some of those things or not do some of those things. So she talked to you a little bit about a rule of life. And if you weren't here that week, on your chairs, actually, when you came in today, we have the same printout that she handed out that week that just has a way that you can create a rule of life. You listen to her week 2 sermon, that will help you with that. But you can go to thecommonrule.org, which will help you understand a little bit what that is. It's basically setting up in your life some commitments that you want to have in order to form your life around Jesus. It could be more time in prayer in the mornings or more time in the scriptures or time just meditating on the gratitude that you have for your life, or she talked about a sabbatical as well, and a couple of resources for you by Justin Early, The Common Rule and Habits of the Household, she recommended, which were great. Then last week, Kenny talked about what it looks like to learn from Jesus, and one of the questions he asked was, who can learn from Jesus? So he asked the question, who did Jesus teach? And he put this awesome list of the 12 disciples up here and some of their personality attributes. And what we found is all of the 12 disciples that Jesus picked out were usually like pretty much some version of, loudmouths or stupid or criminals. Like, that's kind of who followed Jesus around. And so if you're anywhere from great to despicable, then you fall into this category. So who can learn from Jesus? Well, if you're one of these people or something like them, you qualify to learn from Jesus. So Kenny told us that you are exactly who Jesus is searching for. And he even gave us a great resource called Streetlights. It's an audio version of the Bible. If you don't have time to read this scripture, or if reading like words on a page just aren't your thing, there's an audio book of the Bible. This is mixed with like hip hop beats. There's another one on your app store, whether you use Android or iPhone or whatever else you use. This is called the Bible app, and either one of those has ways of reading the scripture to you. And Kenny said last week, and I agree, Having the Bible read to you counts as reading the Bible, okay? So don't make yourself feel like, oh man, I'm disqualified because I didn't read it with my own eyeballs. Look, you read the book even if you had to listen to the book. That's okay. Full credit. You don't even get deducted like a partial point, okay? Full credit for that. And we want you to be invested in that, jump into that. So this was a great resource he mentioned last week. There's an app for this on the App Store that's really good. But there's other ways to do it as well. And we just want to encourage you to spend time with Jesus, learning from Jesus. So that's what we looked at. Being with Jesus, learning from Jesus over the last couple of weeks. And today we're going to talk about this last piece, being like Jesus. How to be like Jesus. Because here's the reality. Probably a number of you either know of someone or you are someone who has maybe spent a lifetime going to church and maybe even memorizing or studying scripture, but you look at their life and it doesn't look very different from anybody else who isn't a Christian at all. In fact, I didn't have time to pull all these onto the screen today, but study after study after study has shown in the U.S. that most Christians mostly look like most non-Christians most of the time. Our value systems, the way we see the world, the way we interact, the way we are offended or not offended, angry or not angry, the way that we are generous or not generous, most Christians in the U.S. look like most non-Christians most of the time. And so there's just this reality that for many of us, we've done the things on the outside, it looks like maybe we're very spiritual or religious people, but we don't actually have a transformed heart underneath it. I took my children to the Los Angeles Zoo a couple of weeks ago. This is Jack on the far side, and William on the closer to me. William's holding a bag of Cheetos because I have pictures of him all over the country holding bags of Cheetos, okay? So he loves Cheetos. They had a really, really great time. And then when we finished up, we went to the gift shop at the Los Angeles Zoo because we can't go anywhere without going to the stupid gift shop. So we went to the gift shop, and the kids let them pick out two things. And so William got a wolf, just a regular wolf that he calls a dire wolf. It's not, but we don't have the heart to tell him. So he's got a dire wolf. And then he got these binoculars. And these were about $12.99. And if you were to be able to look through them right now, you would know that they were about $12.99. These are not a high-quality item. In fact, I'm looking at you through these. You look closer without them than with them on, okay? That's the quality item we have here. So he was excited about these. He wanted his own pair of binoculars, and he wore these around the rest of the day. Now, after the zoo, we decided to go eat dinner and go see a movie. So we went to go see the Marvels, because Marvel released another movie, which means I'm out $70. So we went to the movie theater to go watch that, and he still had these around his neck. Halfway through the movie, my youngest William leans over to me, and he says, "Dad, I have to go poop." And I said, "Oh, okay." When he says the word with that kind of spitball on it, you know what he means it. So we get up, and I'm like, I'm going to miss, parts of the movie. It's fine. I go with him to the bathroom, and it's totally empty, right? Lots of stalls, lots of urinals, and I tell him to go in. So he goes in the stall, and he starts using the restroom, and then I'm just kind of leaning against the stall section, and the urinals are on the other side of the bathroom. I'm just kind of looking at the urinals. And I didn't have my phone with me or anything, so my mind just started to wander, and I started to think a lot about urinal etiquette. And if you don't know what that is, be thankful you came today because you're going to learn so much the next minute. Okay, so here's what I started thinking about. When you have urinals, there's a rule. It's unwritten, and probably no person ever pulled you aside to tell you this, but I'll just name it this morning. The rule at the urinal is you want to leave as much space between you and anybody else using the urinal as maximally possible, okay? So if you walk in and it's totally empty, you should go to the very far side, okay? So that if somebody else has to use a urinal, that they have the ability to be maximally distant from you, okay? So it's fair to go to the far, also fair to go to this side. You could choose a side, okay? It's fine. And if you walk into the restroom as a guy and someone's using this urinal, then suck it up, Buttercup. You have to walk all the way across the room and use that one, okay? That's just, and this is the same whether there's 5 urinals or 42, okay? Just hike it over there and do it. Now, if 2 people are using the urinal, then the third person comes in the bathroom, then they are supposed to use this one, okay? See, so we've got a little bit of crowbar of separation there between the urinals. Now, I know what question many of you are asking. What are the other 2 urinals for? Nothing. Nobody ever uses them. They're basically for decoration purposes only, okay? Or extreme emergencies. That's it. And if you walk in and you do what you're supposed to do and use this urinal, and one other person walks in and uses that urinal, finish quickly. They're probably a psychopath serial killer, okay? Like, you just got to get out of there, right? So this is what's going through my mind as I'm leaning against the stall and my kid is using the restroom. And then I realize if someone else walks in here right now and they don't know my kid is in the stall, I am just staring at the urinals with a pair of binoculars around my neck. What are you doing, right? So it's not going to be good because I was holding them for him. And so that was kind of how that went. And so I took them off because I realized that wouldn't look good, right? But they didn't know the whole situation. They wouldn't know how I ended up with a pair of binoculars around my neck. And here's the thing. Appearances can be deceiving. Someone can look like a psychopath serial killer, but it may just be that they either weren't taught urinal etiquette by their father, who failed them miserably, by the way, or that they were holding a pair of binoculars for their kid that bought a terrible pair at the zoo. Appearances can be deceiving. You can have the appearance of being a very religious, very spiritual person. That's the appearance that you can have because you're at church all the time. You read the Bible. You have passages of Scripture memorized, and yet the people who know you best may know that your life doesn't look much different from most people most of the time. They can know that about you. Appearances can be deceiving. So today, I just want to be fairly personal about this as we talk about the idea of what does it look like to be like Jesus. And I just want to tell you two very simple things from my own life. Now listen, my life is not perfect. I don't look like Jesus. I'm not like Jesus all the time. I'm way better than I was 10 years ago. And those who know me the best would be willing to agree with both things, that I do look better than I did 10 years ago, I do better than I did 10 years ago, and also that I'm not perfect and I haven't made it yet, right? So please, I'm not trying to use myself as an example because I think I am the end-all, be-all. In fact, there are people within this church who've been followers of Jesus for far longer than I have, who God has worked on far more than he's worked on me up to this point, who are inspiring to me. Thank you guys for living faithfully for so many years, trusting in Jesus and following after Jesus. But I just want to give you two major things, and they're not going to seem like horribly insightful insights. I want to give you two major things, though, that I think are the two biggest reasons. I really thought about this last week, that my life looks the way it does today. And they're real simple, but here's a couple of things that have changed me. Here's what's changed me. First of all, a ravishing picture of who Jesus is. A ravishing picture of who Jesus is. Your picture of Jesus, right, who we're told over and over in the New Testament, is the exact representation of the Father. So however you understand Jesus to be, that's what God is like. Your picture of Jesus, I think, is one of the most important things about you. Because to whatever degree that your picture of Jesus is an ugly picture or a bad picture or a scared picture, a fearful picture, I believe that that will affect your affection toward God and therefore your obedience to him. The way that you live your life will look less like him because your picture of him is not as beautiful as it's depicted to be in the New Testament. Right? Over and over and over again, we're told that Christ is the exact representation of God. And it is that beauty that's supposed to actually lead us to God. The Apostle Paul tells us in the book of Romans in chapter 2 and verse 4 that it is the kindness of God that leads us to repentance. It's his kindness that leads us to repentance. So to whatever degree your picture of God, your picture of Jesus has been warped. And for many of us, our picture of God has been put together by, things that we heard a pastor say one time, things that our mom or our grandma used to say, things that we heard maybe on a Christian talk radio, or we read in a book somewhere that a professor said when we were in college, or we heard on a Sam Harris podcast. Like, we've taken all these little things and we put them together to make some kind of picture of Jesus. And what I learned in my 20s is that whatever picture of Jesus I had from putting all that stuff together and creating kind of a Frankenchrist, it was not the right picture of Jesus. Many people use Jesus to just trot him out as like a mascot, as an excuse to do whatever they were going to do anyway, as an excuse to believe whatever they're going to believe anyway. And if Jesus has never upset you, if Jesus has never turned your world upside down, if Jesus has never made you rethink some things in your life, then I would submit to you it's very unlikely that you're following the actual biblical Jesus. There ought to be some things that you thought before that you realize are no longer viable because the way of Jesus points us in a different direction. There ought to be some things that you did before that you realize are no longer viable because the way of Jesus points us in a different direction. And so in my 20s, what I did for a couple of years was I spent a lot of time immersing myself in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I wanted to understand Jesus. And the picture of Jesus I found in reading those Gospels over and over and over again was so much richer and more complex and more curious and more interesting than whatever Frankenchrist I had assembled in my mind before that it changed everything about my life over the course of those couple of years. And I realized, yes, Jesus is loving and Jesus is kind and Jesus is gracious. That's true. But he's not hippy-dippy Jesus who's just, walking around smoking a blunt and talking about peace all the time. That is not the picture that we see in the Gospels. This Jesus cares so much about the lives of others, cares so much about other people experiencing the joy of a relationship with God that he is furious at those who would prevent them from doing it. He's constantly broadening the circle and inviting more people into the fold. He's constantly, there's a story about him at a well where he's talking to this woman in the middle of the day. She's there in the middle of the day, which was unusual because she's been ostracized by her village because she's had 5 husbands up till this point. And so here is a Jewish man talking to a Samaritan woman at a well in the middle of the day. There's 14 reasons why it was socially considered taboo for this to even happen. But Jesus engages with her despite the fact that other people would have been scandalized by this conversation because he loves her. Oh, how he loves her. When the rest of the village doesn't, he does. And Jesus was powerful and courageous. It's not just a message of love and peace. It's like a message, it's a hard-fought message of love and peace. He gave his life for it. He was willing to die for it. He was willing to call out the religious leaders of his day. You know, I said in week 1 of this series that Dallas Willard tells us that the thing that following Jesus should do for you over the course of your life, if you really commit to him, is it should make you almost impossible to offend, which is strange because today we live in a culture that's offended by everything all the time. We're offended performatively, right? We want to let other people know how offended we are. So we get on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or X or Threads or TikTok, right? We'll make a TikTok video that's somebody else's video saying something that we find offensive, and our little head will be in the bottom pointing to the thing that we find offensive, and then we'll tell other people that we're offended in the same video. Like, we want everybody to know exactly what offends us. It's like the person who can be the most outraged is the person who has the most clout in our culture. But if you were to be truly formed and shaped by Jesus, you'd be almost impossible to offend. Because you don't get your worth and your value from anything but God. You recognize that they can say whatever they want that doesn't actually impact you. The only time Jesus seems actually offended is when religious leaders of his day missed God and therefore led other people astray. Jesus is upset, he's offended when God is misrepresented to the people who need him most. That's when Jesus is offended. Right, so I started to understand this ravishing picture of who Jesus is. I could go on and on and on. But it changed my life because I realized he's so much more complex. He loves us so much more than I imagined. But the second thing that really mattered a lot, there was a second secret, like, okay, but how does transformation in a life happen? It's a great question. There's the very first Avengers movie. I didn't expect to talk about Marvel so much today, but here we are. Okay, so the very first Avengers film, there's a character, Bruce Banner, who is the Incredible Hulk. And when we saw him earlier, he had a hard time controlling his anger and his rage. But now he walks around all the time without having any issues. He's just able to control it. And so the whole movie, the Avengers are like, what's going on? How are you controlling it? So at the end, he tells them his secret. So you've got Mark Ruffalo and playing the Incredible Hulk, and he says, here's what his secret is. He says, I'm always angry, right? Because normally he would turn to the Hulk when he got angry. He said, here's my secret, I'm just always angry. And I just keep it bubbling beneath the surface, and then I can control, I can take it up or down, I can become the Hulk or not because I'm always angry. I actually looked for an image online that would have like that quote next to his face, and I couldn't find one, but someone made one of those like beautiful quote scenes out of it. It just looks so weird. That's my secret, Cap, I'm always angry, and there's an ocean and seagulls and stones. It's just so weird, right? So that's my secret, Cap, I'm always angry. Rawr, right? Like that's kind of how it goes. So then he turns into the Hulk right after that and helps the Avengers like save the day, win the day. So what's actually changed me? What's the secret? I'm not always angry. Like, in fact, I'm way less angrier than I used to be because Jesus has transformed my life. Here's the secret. Jesus is never far from my mind. Jesus is just never far from my mind. Just a few practical things around this. When I wake up in the morning, I try to start every day out with a prayer. I don't do it every single day. I try to start every day out with a prayer. It's a prayer of gratitude and thanksgiving. I thank Jesus for what he did for me on the cross, what he did for us, what he did for the world on the cross. I thank Jesus for the blessings in my life, and I name them because I want to frame my day in gratitude. I may have a lot of things to do that day, some of which I don't want to do, some of which I'm dreading. I may be walking through a hard period of life where I'm experiencing some suffering because I've lost a loved one. There may be all kinds of things going on, but I want to frame the day in gratitude and to keep Jesus at the front. I want to spend the day with Jesus, essentially. I want him forefront for me. And when I do this well, my day is better. And when I forget to do this, or I wake up going 1,000 miles an hour because I have so much to do today and I just skip right over this, my day is worse. I know this. And so what I try to do is I just try to keep Jesus to where he's never far from my mind. And in doing so, oftentimes because I'm thinking about like, how would Jesus do this or how would Jesus do that, right? And you can't answer that question unless you've immersed yourselves in the Gospels and you know something about what Jesus would do. It doesn't matter if you have a WWJD bracelet on if you can't actually answer the question, what would Jesus do, right? That doesn't matter. And so I've immersed myself in the Gospels. I have a ravishing picture of who he is in my mind. And then throughout the day, as I find my behavior, my thought patterns not lining up with what Jesus would want, I'm often able to self-correct. Not always. Sometimes I get carried away. But I'm often able to self-correct. I had an experience this last week where I was very upset with one of my children, and I felt myself getting angry to where I was about to yell and be basically very unhelpful because it wasn't going to be able to name what was happening and help them work through and process their emotions and help correct the behavior. But I just wanted to, you get to that bubbling place where you're just like, you're no longer kind of in control. You're just, like that. And I didn't want to turn into that. And there was just like this little, still small voice in the back of my head, like, hey, be Christ to your son right now. That doesn't mean we're not disciplining. We discipline all the time. It doesn't mean we're not, correcting. We correct all the time. But how you do it matters. And I want his memory of how I corrected and disciplined him to be in alignment with the Jesus his dad says he follows. And so I self-corrected. Why? Because Jesus is never far from my mind. I love him so much. And that's changed everything for me. If you hear nothing else this series, right, we've given you some tips, some tricks, like some rule of life stuff. It's great. Your life will only be transformed to the degree that Jesus is beautiful to you and on your mind. That's the secret. There's actually not that much to it. But the more you allow that to be how you live, the more you will find it transforming every part of your being. I just want to conclude today. We're going to look for the next 10 minutes or so at a passage that I find helpful as helping to paint part of that ravishing, beautiful picture of Jesus. There are many of these, obviously, but this is the one I wanted to kind of focus on today. It's from Matthew 26. This story takes place on the night that Jesus had his last meal with his apostles, with his disciples. And then after that meal, he goes out to the Garden of Gethsemane and he decides to pray because he knows that he's about to be arrested and tried and crucified over the coming hours. So he asks 3 of his disciples to come with him, Peter, James, and John. Those are the 3 that were kind of in his inner circle. And he asks them to stay awake and keep watch while he goes to pray. And it doesn't go super well for them. But the wrestling that Jesus does with his prayer in the garden, I think, is astounding. And when I really allow myself to think about what it is that he's going through here, it almost takes my breath away. So I just want to share it with you and help you to dive a little bit deeper into this story. And that's really all we want to do today. Here it is. Matthew chapter 26, we read this. Then Jesus went with them to the olive grove called Gethsemane, and he said, "Sit here while I go over to pray." And he took Peter and Zebedee's 2 sons, James and John, and he became anguished and distressed. And he told them, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." This is so interesting, by the way, that Matthew and John also depicts Jesus here as his soul being crushed with grief to the point of death. No one's whipped him yet. No one's arrested him yet. No one's nailed him to a cross yet. And he is crushed with grief to the point of death. In fact, we're told in some of the other Gospels that he's so grieved that he sweats blood, which we know that sometimes your capillaries come to the surface and some of them can burst when you become deeply, deeply anxious and grieved about something. Or it could be that he's just sweating so profusely, it's as if it's blood. It's tough to tell from the translation that we have, but best we can tell, he is so grieved. Why is this? The early Christians were known. They were known for facing death by the Roman Empire in a prayerful, worshipful, and often happy state. In fact, one of the early church fathers named Tertullian says that it is the blood of martyrs that is the seeds for the church. In other words, people who were killed by the Roman Empire for following after Jesus Christ died such honorable deaths that other people started to follow Jesus because they were so overcome with how these people chose to go out, giving their life, submitting it to the Lord. So we have these early stories. Even in the book of Acts, we have Stephen who is preaching the gospel, and he's telling those that, like, look, here's why Jesus came. And they get so angry and so upset they begin to stone him. But he continues, he prays for them in the midst of this stoning. And so this particular artistic piece, he's got this kind of like peaceful, beatific view on his face as he's praying for them because he died a good death. We're told this in the book of Acts. One of the early church fathers named Polycarp, we're told in his 80s, was arrested, and they tied him to a stake and burned him alive But we're also told by the witnesses who were there that he prayed to God as he was burning, not screaming, not wailing, but into your hands I commit my spirit, basically taking a line from Jesus. This is how he went out. We're told that Ignatius of Antioch was taken to Rome because he would not go against Jesus and fed to the beast, fed to the lions. There's some question about the historicity of this story, like whether it happened exactly this way or not. But in the artistic rendering of this martyr, I mean, even look at the expression on his face. He looks annoyed at worst at those lions, okay? Why? Because he had a greater view of a greater future in mind. All of these face suffering and death, and yet they did so with a worshipful spirit somehow. And here we see Jesus, who, before he's even whipped or arrested or crucified, like is anguished to the point of death. It seems like he's not taking his death as well as they did. Why would the gospel writers tell us this? Why is Jesus suffering so much before his death? And I think the reason he's suffering so much before his death is because he is facing a kind of death that no one else in the history of the cosmos has ever faced. And the clue to what that looks like is actually found in the next passage. Verse 39, Jesus went on a little farther and he bowed with his face to the ground and he prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine." He talks about this cup of suffering. He uses this cup of suffering to represent all that he's about to go through, all that he's about to experience. And what is the deal with this cup of suffering? The cup of suffering in the first century would have been understood similarly to how the electric chair would be understood today. It meant death by execution by the state, basically. In fact, Socrates, one of the greatest philosophers of Athens, who we know about because of his student Plato, when he was 70 years old, he was arrested and tried and killed by Athens because he was unsettling everybody. He was questioning the authorities. He was questioning their way of thought. He was questioning the way that they do things. He was questioning the way that they did commerce. And so they finally killed him. 70 years old, obviously does CrossFit, in best shape of his life. He looks really good here. And in this particular painting, painted by a French artist during the Renaissance, he's trying to paint the most tension-filled part of the story, which is before he actually drinks of this cup. But they put poison in this cup, and he drank it, and he died. That's the story. So when Jesus starts talking about, like, taking a cup, this is what's in his mind, execution by the state. The cup represented judicial death. But in this case, it's not just death by the state. It is death by God the Father himself. Why did Jesus have to die? The answer to that is multifaceted. We don't have time to go into all of it today, but I just want to talk about one particular element of it today. God hates sin. God hates sin for the same reason that Jesus chastised the religious leaders that kept those who wanted to follow God from him. God hates sin because he loves you. And he knows that every hurt you've ever experienced in your life, every pain, every time somebody stabbed you in the back, every time someone talked badly about you, every time someone gave you a hard time in school, every time you had a relationship fall apart, a mess of like all of that happened as a result of sin. We look at the death and the suffering in the world, and there's just this uneasiness that we know, like, yes, there is sin, there is brokenness that exists in the world. God hates that because he loves you. And so the wrath of God, all of his anger at the way sin has broken you and destroyed you and hurt you, at the way you, intentionally or unintentionally, have hurt others, broken others, destroyed others. All of that wrath needed to be poured out on sin so he could deal with the sin problem, the pain that we all face. And so what Jesus did, according to the Gospels, is he took all the sin of the world, past, present, and future, he placed it on himself. He who knew no sin became sin, we are told in the New Testament. He who knew no sin became sin so that the wrath of the Father could be poured out on the sin as it existed in Jesus. When I was a kid, I thought that Jesus protected me from the wrath of God toward me personally, that God was super angry at me personally, and that God was so mad at me, he just wanted to basically kill me or slap me or hurt me, but that Jesus stepped in at the last minute and said, don't kill him, kill me. What's more biblical, I think, than that understanding by far, is that God had to pour out his wrath not on you personally, but on sin. And so long as sin was inside of you, you would then bear the brunt of that wrath. And so Jesus came to fix that problem because God's wrath on you would destroy you. But God's wrath on Jesus, it killed him. But then he raised to life. And so God pours out his wrath on the sin that now sits on the shoulders of Jesus Christ. And Jesus has to face that suffering. Here's what happens in that moment. One of the sayings that Jesus says on the cross is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Scholars have debated for many years why it is that he says that specifically, but it seems at the very least that the sin that Jesus took upon himself and the wrath of God poured out on that sin to destroy it, to break its hold over us, to give us an opportunity to come back to God and to have a right relationship with him, that the wrath of God poured out on that sin did something to at least temporarily sever the relationship between the Father and the Son. So the Father and the Son, who have been one for all of eternity, now face a separation of some sort, and far more painful than the physical lashes that Jesus received, or the pain that he received in having himself nailed to a tree, or the pain he received by finally suffocating and dying on that cross. Far more painful than that was the pain of being separated from his Father, who he had never been separated for all of existence, all up until that time. And the cup represented judicial death by the state and judicial death by God the Father, who poured his wrath out on sin that his Son took upon himself because he could take it and you and I couldn't. And in doing so, and being willing to sacrifice like that, he's made a way for us to have right relationship with him. This is what Jesus sees coming for us. George MacDonald talks about God's wrath towards sin like this. He says, God, he is always against sin, and insofar as and while they and sin are one, he is against them. He's against people who have sin in them, right? He's against their desires, their aims, their fears, and their hopes, and thus he is altogether for them, right? As long as we have a life that is imbued with sin, then God is against our aims, our goals, and our hopes, because those will ultimately lead to our destruction and the destruction of those around us. And so in being against our sinful selves, he is altogether for us. He loves us so much, he does not want us to continue to go on like that. And we want this from God. We want God to hate the stuff in the world that damages human beings. We want God to hate the war that happens and the countless lives that are lost. We want that. You want God to hate that which harms us. And Jesus shows us he does. But he also loves us so much that he wasn't willing for us to bear the brunt of that wrath and that hatred. He took it upon himself. Matthew chapter 26, Jesus returned to the disciples and he found them asleep, and he said to Peter, couldn't you watch with me even 1 hour? So he's like, hey, guys, stay here awake. Like I'm in agony right now. Can you stay awake? And they couldn't, right? You ever had a big Thanksgiving meal and some wine? This is what they had just done, right? And then he's like, stay awake for an hour. And they're like, oh, geez, okay, we'll try. They didn't. See, he said, you can't even do it for an hour. Keep watch and pray so that you will not give in to temptation. And then he says something I love, actually. For the spirit is willing, but the body is weak. In other words, he's like, I know you want to do this. Your spirit is willing, but your body is weak. You're struggling with it. I love that Jesus says that, because what that means is that Jesus gives partial credit, right? He said, oh, I know you want to, but you're not quite there yet. So he leaves them then, and he goes back to pray. And this is what we read. Then Jesus left them a second time, and he prayed, my Father, if this cup cannot be taken away unless I drink it, your will be done. So he prays it again, right? I'm going to take this cup, your will be done if I have to. When he returned to them again, he found them sleeping, for they couldn't keep their eyes open. He just sees this over again. Jesus keeps naming that this cup is hugely problematic. It's going to basically destroy the way that things have been for all of eternity, at least temporarily. And the weight of that, the existential terror of that, is sitting for me to take it. And I don't want it. Jesus is honest. And I love this example in prayer, to be able to say, I don't want it, to be able to be honest with God, but also submissive to him. This is not what I want. But if it's your will, Father, if it's the only way to save them, I'll do it. If you've been at a restaurant, you order like a bottle of wine, and they come and they pour that like first little bit for you to take a sip. And so you swirl the glass around to pretend like you're a sommelier. And then you smell because you saw that in a movie once, and then you take a sip. And really, whether it's the best thing you've ever tasted or the worst, you're going to tell them, oh, it's great, go ahead and pour more, right? Because you don't want them walking into the kitchen and being like, oh, this customer I have, right? Like, you don't want that. So you just kind of take it. Jesus is fully aware of what he's getting himself into by taking of this cup. And it's in Gethsemane that he starts to suffer because the weight of what he's about to do becomes real. And before he's arrested, before a whip ever touches his body, before he is nailed to a tree, before he breathes his last, he gets it. He knows what he's about to do. Jonathan Edwards, famous pastor from the Great Awakening days of the United States, says this: if Jesus Christ did not fully know before he took the cup, right, and drunk it, it would not properly have been his own act as a human being. Like, if he doesn't actually know what he's fully getting himself into, then submitting to it isn't a big deal. But when he took that cup knowing what he was doing, right, knowing what he did, so was his love to us infinitely more wonderful, and his obedience to God the Father infinitely more perfect. He starts to suffer in Gethsemane to the point of death because he gets it. He fully understands what's coming. His eyes are completely open. And he takes it anyway. Because he loves you. And he wants you to have a relationship with the Father. So we went back to pray a third time, saying the same things again. He just keeps saying the same thing over and over. I don't want to, but I will. I know it's going to be awful, but I'll do it. He died the death we should have died. It's us that were sinful, but he died the death that we should have died. That's what he did for us. And when you start to understand that, like every other religious tradition in the world outside of Christianity has a goal, and that goal can be some version of heaven or enlightenment or reincarnation or merging back into the whole of creation. That every tradition has some kind of goal, and it has a way to get there. And the way to get there is always something you have to do, some list of rules that you have to obey, something that you have to accomplish. Christianity says you can't do it. You're just not that good. Compared to God's holiness and righteousness, like, you don't have the capability. So God loved you so much, he did it for you. He died the death you should have died. He took the sin upon himself and allowed the full wrath to be poured out on that sin so that sin would no longer prohibit you from having right relationship with God. That's what Jesus did. When you start to understand that, you start to understand, like, oh man, if that's what Jesus did for me, then when I go through life and I face suffering, my suffering may be very real, and it may be very challenging and very difficult. I may have a harder life than many, many other people. And yet, no matter what my suffering is like, when I think about the cup that Christ chose to drink, the actual severance between him and the Father in some way that we don't fully understand, that had never happened up till that point in history, the receiving of the wrath of your own Father in order to take away the sin of the world, like whatever my cup looks like, it doesn't look like that. I can go through life with some amount of joy and gratitude, not because I'm naive to my own suffering or to the difficulty inherent in this world, but because I know Jesus took far more. And not only did he die the death we should have died, but he lived the life we should have lived. And it's only in understanding the first thing, that he sacrificially died the death that we should have died, that we can start to do the second thing, live the life that we should live. He did it. He modeled it. He showed us how to do it. But you can go to church your whole life and read as many Bible verses as you want and still not look anything like it if you're not transformed by the sacrifice that he made. And here's the thing, too. I love this. You won't do this right away either. None of us will. It's years of one foot in front of the other. In fact, Timothy Keller says it this way. I'm so appreciative of this. He says, so Jesus is a great model of how to live, pray, and relate to people. But remember that if Jesus is only a model for us, then he is no encouragement, for he is too good. In other words, if you look at the life of Jesus and you're like, oh, I want to be with Jesus and learn from Jesus how to be like Jesus. If you just look at his life and compare it to your own, you'll just get depressed. He's too good. You can't be that good. Think about the way that you are a friend, or the way that you are a worker, an employee, or the way that you are a husband or a wife or a parent. If you just compare to the way that you exist in the world, and you compare it to Jesus, it just feels overwhelming. I can't possibly be that good. In fact, my grandfather on my mom's side, who I never really got to know, he was 2 years old when I was 2 years old when he passed away. If he was 2 when I passed away, that'd be so weird. I was 2 years old when he passed away. I am told by lots of people who knew him well that he was just a really good and decent man. He turned his back on any kind of Christianity for most of his life. And the sentence he would say to my mom and to others is, I can just never be that good. And here's the thing. He was right. He couldn't. And you can't. And I can't. And Christianity is the only religious tradition that says, that's okay. Because God loved you so much. Jesus gave his life and severed his relationship with the Father temporarily so that you wouldn't have to. So look at his life, but he can't just be a model. He's just too good. He goes on, no one can live up to his standard. Jesus came not just to be a model, but a savior. He changes us on the inside so that we can be slowly but surely made over into his image. And that last little phrase is so helpful for me because the slowly but surely thing, like if I compare myself to where I was 20 years ago as a follower of Jesus, I am so grateful for the transformation I see in my life. If I compare myself with where I was a couple of weeks ago, it feels really slow. But Jesus came so that you could slowly and surely, after being connected to God, become more and more like him. He does not just tell us how to live. He gives us the power to live that way. The paradox is that only if we see him as a substitute rather than just a model can we actually have the ability to live according to his model. My grandfather, who believed, I don't know if I can be a Christian because I can never be that good, he was absolutely right. And many of us, I've heard lots of my friends, family members say something over the years like, man, I want to be a Christian, I want to be a good Christian, but I'm afraid like because of everything I've done or because of everything I keep doing, like I'm just not good enough. And then he's going to be so disappointed in me, he's just going to turn away. He's not going to have time for me. Jesus took the full wrath of the Father upon sin on his shoulders. He drank of the cup knowing full well exactly what the price would be because he loved you so much he was willing to do it. That's who he is. And just because you can't get your marriage straight, just because you can't stop, with this addiction or this habit or this tick you have that you know doesn't honor God, like you think that's going to make him turn away from you or be so disappointed in you that he won't have anything to do with you. He took the full weight of the wrath of God. He took hell upon his shoulders for you. There's nothing you can do that'll make him turn away from you. And when you start to understand the substitute he was, then you can start to live the life he lived. This is the love you have searched for all your life. You will not find love like this in another person. You won't find it in career accomplishment. You won't find it in knowledge and information. You won't find it in the most amazing filmed for television romance you can imagine. Hallmark is releasing 42 new Christmas movies this year. You won't find it there. You'll find it here. And the more that sinks in, the more you'll be like Jesus. The more you'll be transformed. Father, thank you. Thank you for the teaching of Jesus, who over and over let us know what we were invited into, and at the same time let us know there's no way we could possibly do it on our own. Thank you that 2,000 years ago, in a garden in Gethsemane, despite the fact that he did not have much support from his disciples, in the stillness of a place where he was all alone, that he chose to do what he had to do in order to free us and to give us new life. God, may his sacrifice press us forward to live the life that he lived. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.